Hello, good to see you. Good to see you out there. Tonight, it's a very humbling experience to try to prepare for this. On Wednesday nights, in the previous sessions, we've been looking at the book of Hebrews, and it is an amazing, very interesting, exciting book. It's in the New Testament. I think we're on chapter 10 or so currently. I think we begin somewhere chapter 10, roughly verse 14 or so. What my plan is tonight is to go back through the sessions in general to summarize as best we can in nutshells about each book, 1 through 10 more or less. To give you some ideas about what the book of Hebrews is, who wrote it, and what the main themes or ideas are. And to be able to do that in an hour, when I think at least the last month or so, the sessions that I've attended more or less recently, Pastor Jeff will look at, maybe one stanza, one passage, much less a whole chapter, in one given night, in an hour. So, and going through so much in here that I'll go ahead and say that I apologize because I probably missed a lot of the sections that may be your favorite. I just went through all the books, or the chapters, to try to figure out exactly for myself, being a student of this very much, coming to it, never read Hebrews before Wednesday night, to try to summarize what in the world this book is really about. So, let's get started. I'd like to kind of start with the idea of context, and just, if you can understand the basic context of what's going on, if you just try to read at the very beginning and go through this, you'll be in Romans pretty quick, trying to understand what in the world, who's this written for, who's written by, when. So I kind of like to start with context first, the timeline. And the timeline, in general, helps me think about the Roman chronological aspects of history, how to understand history. I have to look at it that way. And for that, I kind of like to start with the Romans, because the Romans are in the background, as well known, the empire. Okay? So I always start with my students, especially, and just to give you a little bit about myself, I teach ancient Latin at the high school level, at the collegiate level, and many of my students, even at the collegiate level, are really unaware of the history of the Romans, more than just a couple of facts about maybe Julius Caesar or Augustus. But what we're going to look back at is, in general, around 1200 BC, is the Battle of Troy, the War of Troy, the Trojan War, and that's a long time ago. I know that, but as we go forward, we at least mythologically we see that the Romans will turn into the Trojans turn into the Romans, and the Romans are obviously very, very important for us. We also have around 800 BC Homer's famous epics, the Iliad and the Odyssey, very important for epic and very important for the oral storytelling tradition and things. So this is a great window of things to get us started in the timeline. James?
So Troy was conquered by Rome?
No. The Greeks will conquer Troy, the Trojans. So you have two groups here, the Greeks and the Trojans. That's why we call it the Trojan War. At least mythologically, Augustus is going to have Virgil to write the Aeneid and say, we're going to try to tie our bloodlines back to Troy, okay? Because if we can do that, it will show that we have blood in our lineage.
I didn't know that.
A lot of stuff there, but basically, mythologically anyway, Virgil and Augustus are going to try to argue in that great epic about the Romans that they link back to the Trojans. Okay.
Interesting.
So as you go forward into time, we're still in BC here. We get up to around 753 or so. Rome begins, Romulus and Remus, the founding of Rome, that kind of thing. Eventually what you're going to get is the three great sections of Rome. You have the monarchy, which is mostly kings. They're setting up Rome, basically trying to establish their kings, and as they go through. And we're probably a little bit more familiar, around 500 or so, the Great Republic begins. And the Republic is basically transitioned from the idea of the monarchy, because there was a king here. You've heard of Lucretia, and Lucretia was raped by one of the king's sons, and that transitions us into the Republic, because the next day she commits suicide in front of these senators, and the senators run off the bad kings. And that's why we get the Republic, the idea of different forms of representative government.
Which is where we get our form.
Exactly. That's where you're starting to see it come in now. You see the idea of government here from the U.S. is really taking it up and imitating this idea of the Republic. Now, in the beginning,
around 500 BC to roughly 250 BC. We're going over here, we're going to talk about Augustus for just a second. Obviously, we're looking at the year 0 and the birth of Christ really soon, right? But the idea here is that during this first 250 years, the idea of Rome is very virtuous. Very virtuous. We're talking about great stories of virtue, integrity. The idea of piety comes in. This is a very Roman word, by the way. The idea of piety here is the idea of valuing your family, the gods, and the state. The state becomes so important that basically, as you're going through the Republic, generals get so much power that they begin to run everything. This is where Caesar's going to come in a little bit later. He's following a path of all these great generals who have so much power that they end up walking into Rome and taking over. That's basically what's happening. You've heard the pastor mention quite a few times the crossing of the Rubicon is very analogous to a lot of different situations, because once you do, you don't go back. So that's what's going on. The Senate told Julius Caesar, you need to disband your army. Because if you don't, we're threatened by you. And he had to think about it for a night, but he didn't do that. He walked in and just basically took Rome. There was nobody there, basically, okay? So as we're getting all known through here, I just wanted to talk about that because as we see, and there's many stories in here, some of the greatest stories, Julius Caesar gets involved with Cleopatra. Eventually Caesar's assassinated, right? 44 BC, roughly. And then Augustus, his son, which is, we're going to pick up with the idea that's in the background here with Christians and the Jews. Augustus is going to come to power because after Caesar is murdered, the great Antony takes up power with Octavian, okay, who's Augustus later, and basically they get into this quarrel. Antony sides with Cleopatra and is starting to almost start an Eastern empire. Octavian says no, he comes in, he fights Antony, and there's this whole battle about trying to get power. Augustus finally gets his power, or Octavian. He becomes Augustus a little bit later and becomes the first emperor. And Augustus is very smart about this because Augustus, and then we're going to get to the book of Hebrews in just a second, but I wanted to kind of look at this. It really gives you context. The idea here is that as Augustus gets power, there's that great transition. We're going to call him an emperor. But he's smart enough to not going to call it that because there's a whole line of these emperors or dictators like Caesar who's going to get murdered. Okay, if you ever wonder what happens to the Romans, any particular Roman, it's because they were assassinated usually. He's smart enough to realize that he doesn't want to call himself that. Okay, and there's this very, very famous, a little bit of Latin here, Senatus Populus Quae Roma, which basically means the Senate and people of Rome. So in other words, Augustus comes into power, instead of calling himself the emperor, basically says, I'm just one of you. I'm one of you. I'm going to help you run this. Smart political move. Exactly. Very smart. Augustus is very smart with all this because at the time that's happening, and what you need to realize is right before Christ is born, basically, there's this huge civil war. Rome is really battling it out, okay, because of the decline of the ethics, the morals, the greed, the wealth that's coming in. They're expanding on an enormous level, okay, out of Italy up into where would be modern France, Belgium, all that, and to the east as well. There's a great civil war about basically the economics, okay, and many other things, but there you go. So just to kind of give you a nutshell, now we're in AD. Once you get to AD, obviously, the whole history and the whole thing you can spend an hour on with the idea here with the calendar changes and things like that. But just, I was researching this and I'm fascinated by this with the timeline with what you're seeing. So generally, I think people tend to think, and see what you think here, but basically around 30 AD supposedly is the cross, okay? We're well into the Julio-Claudian emperors. You've probably heard of Augustus, obviously, Tiberius, Claudius, Nero, Caligula. They're all going to be reigning right during the Gospels. Nero's who executed Paul.
That's right. So 30 AD, the cross. And I'm mentioning this too because we're about to get to the context of Hebrews. 70, we think, or scholars think, there's a lot of trying to figure out these dates. The Gospel of Mark is usually supposedly what a lot of people think come first. Have 80 for Matthew, okay, 85 for Luke, and somewhere around 100 for John.
There's probably differences depending on what scholar you're looking at, take a year or whatever. But generally, that's what's going on. And what's really important about studying Hebrews right away is seeing that it's pre-gospel, okay? It's somewhere right in here. 68 is kind of the number that a lot of people are pointing to, but there's a lot of differences in this too, because some scholars are going to say it was way earlier, and there's all this controversy as you go through all the commentaries about whether Hebrews was actually written first, and it's one of the very first things that's written.
I did not know that they thought
Versus the
Hebrews is
end.
written
Yeah.
first.
There's other people that think it's at the end, that it's way over here, okay? So that's very interesting. And
That's
one thing
really
we know is that right before 70, this is when the temple's destroyed in 70, right?
70 AD, yeah.
Somewhere right in there. So, and he's talking as if it's existing. So that gives us this little hint that it's somewhere around 60 AD.
It was Titus of Rome, I think, that sacked the temple, right? And Jesus prophesied that and said that this temple, will be destroyed and no brick will be left upon another, which was interesting because there was gold in between the bricks. So when Titus sacked the temple, they literally tore every single brick off of each other and got all the gold out of it. Exactly fulfilling to the T what Jesus said.
So giving yourself some context about when is definitely important. And I started saying, okay. But there's so much new research over the last few years. I've been YouTubing a ton of stuff, whether it's Gary Habermas, John Lennox. There's so many of these guys that we're going to look at. One that I'm actually going to reference, I should have a bibliography from all the things that Pastor gave me, but also just some things I've been reading and listening to on the podcast. One is Chuck Missler, and Pastor Jeff is very, very much a fan of Chuck Missler. And I want to mention Chuck Missler because he has a whole book basically that he's going through. You can hear the audio for it. It goes through about an hour worth for each chapter, and going through a lot of stuff. And I've watched a lot of his YouTube. You find him on YouTube or audio as well. And the pastor really likes him. I do as well, just to mention him. But I guess we should start right after this of like, who is the author of Hebrews? And technically, when you open up the King James anyway, it does say the epistle of Paul, the apostle, to the Hebrews. But for many commentaries and many things that I've read and heard in the last few days especially, the idea of it actually being Paul is very controversial. Now, according to Missler, and according to Pastor, and I agree, there's a lot of things that point to the idea of it actually being Paul. From the idea of all the little quirks and quips that he uses, and we know that, well, this is a basic, what is it? The book of Hebrews is technically an epistle, which basically means it's a letter, but it's a lot more formal than that. We're not just talking like, to your friend, dear James, da-da-da-da. It starts off with this very heavy, as you're going through here, rhetoric and different rhetorical styles. And for the sense of that, you should know what rhetoric is. Rhetoric is basically just persuasion, and you're trying to persuade somebody of something. And we know that the great Cicero, Roman Cicero, lived in the time of Augustus, or right before there, and Cicero knew Caesar. There's all these stories about Cicero. Cicero defended Rome basically from these conspirators. There's a Calirian conspiracy where Cicero gets up in front of the Senate, has this great oratory speech about basically making Catiline guilty, okay? And ironic enough, Cicero's very much like the Greek Socrates. This is worth mentioning just for a second because it's worth thinking about how strong rhetoric really is at this age. When you went to school for high school, it probably started somewhere where we would think of as middle school, and as you're going through high school, what you would study is probably not all the things you would study today. One of the things you would study mostly is rhetoric, and the reason for that was because it was very, very useful in the ancient world to be able to go and try to convince people of what you thought, whether you were standing up in public or whatever. You were basically in line, if you went to formal school, to be able to go with your father to go into the Senate probably, okay? And to learn from experience how to lead a politician's life. That's one of the main things anyway. Well, Cicero very much has this bit of oratory where he's basically a rhetorician and trying to prove that Catiline is guilty of trying to burn Rome down and kill Cicero. And then a few years later, after Caesar is killed in his assassination in 44, Cicero starts saying things like, "Why didn't you kill Antony too?"
because we know that Antony and Caesar were best buds back in the other wars, and Antony's kind of like Caesar's right-hand man. And Cicero goes on a whole thing here, talking about Antony later was the bad idea, because we know that Antony took power, right? And he's trying to get things going with Cleopatra. And basically what happens is Cicero eventually just, or Antony gets tired of it and just has Cicero murdered. So one of Rome's great saviors ends up ironically being killed and murdered by his own people. As we know, the great Socrates, very similar story. He's out basically corrupting the youth when he's really just trying to question people. What is virtue? What is all these things? And just question things. You've heard the Socratic method, I'm sure.
Yeah.
And they basically put him on trial for not believing in the gods, when almost every Platonic dialogue points to Socrates starting with prayer. So, or it's in there somewhere. And eventually Socrates has a chance to get away. Like, we can get you away, Socrates. And Socrates says, no, I'm not going to go. You're missing the point. It doesn't matter about death. Why are you worried about death? And Socrates takes up the vial of poison while he's in the cellar there with all the crying women and all his disciples and all this. He drinks the poison, still philosophizing about the gods and all this kind of stuff, and basically just lays down and goes to sleep. So these two great thinkers, rhetoricians, well, especially Cicero, this guy is really in the age of rhetoric. So it makes a lot of sense that what we're seeing from the Epistle of Paul is very much, at least in the Hebrews, I'm not very familiar with all of it, of course, but Hebrews is very much taking up a lot of those things. And why this is important too is that when you see the letter of Paul, there's a lot of things that are quirks that he uses, like grace, he's very familiar with using these ideas of like, therefore, because there's a big chunk of something he's trying to explain, and then therefore, which sounds very simple, like, well, didn't everybody use that? But the way that Paul's using it's very identifiable. And Missler points out quite a few things like that. So he thinks, without a doubt, this seems to be Paul, and others will argue for different reasons, of course. But there you go. So we do think, and I think by opening up, because I've opened up quite a few other Bibles where it doesn't say that the Epistle of Paul, I'm on board with this, seems to be the case. And as well as what you kind of tend to see is that it doesn't really matter who wrote it. It's like, why didn't he sign the document? Why is it that, according to Paul or whatever? And there's a lot of reasons for this. A lot of times when they would roll up the scrolls, what would happen is, I'm not sure about the Jews' tradition, but in the Roman tradition anyway, they would not actually sign the outside of the scroll, we think, or they did sign the outside of the scroll, and over time, because it's exposed, that's the first thing that wore off or disintegrated, or however that works. So that's one thing. Maybe it was signed and then was erased or disintegrated or whatever. And then another reason is that when things would be officially stamped with Paul's name on them, there's a lot of controversy with this, because it was well known that when Paul would actually try to do things, there were riots or whatever's going on here, because we know they're being persecuted. That's the whole thing, why this is being written about, because, well, let's get to that. What is it being written about? What's the main theme here? Well, it's called the Hebrews. So what are we talking about? He's not talking and preaching or trying to persuade people that are just sinners. He's trying to persuade Jews, okay? So the idea here is that the Hebrews, and there's a distinction there, but more or less when we say Jews, we mean Hebrews, and back and forth here, pretty much synonymous. They're already believers, okay? These are Jews that have become the first Christians. So he's really talking to Christians. They're believers. And why does he need to explain all this to Christians? Well, because there's all this turmoil going on in the background here where they're being persecuted, tortured, etc. Okay?
By their own people.
By their own people, exactly.
Not even necessarily so much by Rome.
What's happening is that they're in their Christian faith. They're believers. But all of a sudden, from the actual, I guess you would call this manipulation or something, where the Christians are starting to fall away from their faith and go back to Judaism. They're going back to the original Old Covenant laws because it's safer. It's basically what's going on.
Which, and the reason was safer is, you remember, the Pharisees and the Sadducees, when you followed Christ, I don't know if everybody knows this, they actually kicked you out. Most of the time you lost your job, lost your home, your family who did not follow Christ ostracized you. You never saw them again. So that's why I believe you're right, that it is Paul, and he's encouraging them to say, just keep hammering with the Lord, because yes, this is bad. Yes, you've lost family. Yes, you're going to be on the street for a little while. Trust the Lord, he'll provide. And they were going, well, let's just say we're following the law and we'll get along, to get along. That's not how it works. Because if you're going to deny the Lord before men, he's going to deny you his Father. That's what Paul's saying. Yeah. Is, there is no compromise on this issue. It's what Christ on the cross and your faith in that. Not, well, I believe in Jesus, but I'm going to keep the law. Plus, this is fascinating, by the way.
Let's
Nobody
go
else is
in.
doing this. I'm loving it.
Jesus said, "You will be persecuted."
Yes,
Yeah.
exactly.
Yeah, he says
Yeah.
that. That's good formula.
Yeah.
You could get ready for it because people are not going just like they did treated him.
Yeah, because look at the people
Yeah.
persecuted Jesus. It wasn't Rome. Even remember Pilate.
Exactly.
Pilate didn't even want to kill him.
Right.
Pilate was like, "What are you guys talking about? He didn't
What do you
do
want me to
anything
do?"
wrong."
Exactly.
And it was his own people were screaming, saying, "Let his blood be upon our heads and our children's children," thereby cursing themselves.
So what we see in this book, and I want to try to go through every chapter really quickly. I know we only have maybe 40 minutes roughly, something right here. But building up the context and understanding the context is huge, because if you don't understand that, then you're lost. So as we go forward, I think what I really want to say is in chapter 1, we can start right here, chapter 1 here, what you're setting it up is like, well, who is Jesus? We're just answering that question. And that sounds so obvious to us, but there's this, you got to imagine these people and whatever setting this is. And I think this is a letter that's probably, this isn't just a regular letter that was read once or even read. Maybe it was oratory at some points. I think it probably was. And being used again and again and again and again. He does use the word "we" a lot, so maybe this is being passed around and being used. It's not just one event, I don't think. So first of all, knowing, well, if I'm going to believe in who you're telling me about, then I need to know who that is. And that's basically how the chapter starts. Have we got the scriptures there? Let's see. That's the part 2. But he brings in, and I'll just read right from the very beginning. If you want to follow, I will be using the King James Version and maybe a little bit of the ESV for just some clarification here. But I think the King James is something that's just a default. Chapter 1. Passage 1 here, book of Hebrews. God, who at sundry times and in divers manners spake in time past unto the fathers by the prophets, hath in these last days spoken unto us by his Son, whom he hath appointed heir of all things, by whom also he made the worlds, who being the brightness of his glory and the express image of his person, and upholding all things by the word of his power, when he had by himself purged our sins, sat down on the right hand of the majesty on high. There's so much in that. We could really kind of go in and probably spend an hour on it, as we usually do. But there you go. It's basically just saying who is the Son, understanding that and getting an introduction to it. Okay. What we're going to see over basically the first chapter or 2 is that explanation that there's this idea, okay, that Jesus is fully God and fully man at the same time. And as you go through the chapters, that tends to be flushed out. Okay. Let's see. There's a lot of things here, and I have a lot of extra notes. But I want to get to the next part here. It's the angels part on chapter 1, passage 6. Chapter 1, passage 6. And again, when he bringeth in the first begotten into the world, he saith, and let all the angels of God worship him. There's this idea of trying to explain who Jesus is. And you might think, and I would imagine that to a Jewish audience, or Jewish Christian audience, I could say this, the first thing of saying something like, this man is more important and of more of a priority than angels is just kind of a mind-blowing thing. Like, hang on, how so, why, what are you talking about? He's just a man, wait, what? So there's this idea of that, and that's basically what Paul's trying to explain here. And you start to see, well, it even mentions a little bit later, did he actually ask any of the angels to sit down on his right side? No, of course. And I really got interested in this, and I saw some of the things that Missler was saying, and I'll just kind of read them really quickly here. Because I was like, well, what are angels? And we, kind of see all this stuff in movies and stuff, of course, but when you get down to the actual scripture and try to look through this, like, well, how do you actually define an angel and what's going on and what's the difference, basically, between angels and Christ, of course, but also angels and demons, right? And here's what Missler had to say, for the most part. First of all, angels were created. Okay, they're not eternal. They're not with the idea of being eternal. They're created. They're immortal, but they're not eternal. Okay, they're supposedly immortal. I'm assuming that angels don't die. Okay, heaven is their home, obviously. Okay, they excel in grand strength. They're very strong. They're capable of choices. Mm-hmm. Okay, why are they capable of choices? What's probably the biggest number one thing? You're like, oh yeah, they have choices, all right. Well,
they were given a free will.
yeah, and that free will, we know in the downfall with Satan, some of them, how many supposedly? There's always a
Like
number.
a third.
Yeah, it was a
A huge amount.
But we don't know how many. That could be billions for all we
Right.
know. Who knows?
They fall with Satan because they take that choice. They have a choice. Okay. Let's see what else.
Which that's even more baffling that Paul called Satan's fall the mystery of iniquity. In other words, it just rose out of his own heart.
He chose.
He just chose to
he
sin
chose
after
exactly.
he could have been coexisting in the Lord's presence for, we don't know, trillions of years.
And they just all of a
Yeah,
sudden.
the modern church
choice
kind
to
of
do it.
reads it like God created Satan, and 10 minutes later he's like, you know what, nuts to this. I'm going to do my own thing. No, it could have been hundreds of billion before time. Time actually didn't even come into being until man was created.
There's these other things too, and I wasn't really aware of this. They can assume forms. And
Yes.
I knew that, but I was like, what do you mean? And Missler goes into this. He says they can become invisible.
Mm-hmm.
They can materialize, I'm guessing, between, not being invisible and becoming physical, where you can see them, from a spiritual world or spiritual thing to something physical, I assume. They can also appear as men. Mm-hmm. They can be men, and often in the movie reference, but often in movies, that's exactly what it is. They're just sitting around in a diner. It's like, oh, there's Michael, or whatever. Now, I was like, well, how is that different than demons? And Missler did not go into that too much, but demons cannot do any of these, as far as I know. Now, I don't know if they're immortal or not, but the idea is that they are not capable of choices. They cannot appear as men. They can go into men. Suppose this is where we get the idea of the exorcist, right? So they can control you, I guess, and get inside you or something like this. But they can't actually just appear as someone and kind of walk around and do normal things like angels.
I want to address the demon thing.
Sure,
I think
yeah.
my dad and Chuck Missler did talk about, I think he's right. So when Paul says,
Yeah.
for we wrestle not against flesh and blood, so he gives a power structure. He said, but against principalities, against powers, against the rulers of the darkness of this world. That's not describing the same entities. That's an actual power structure. When we go to the book of Daniel, we get a preview of that. So remember, Dan, I got to point this. So when Daniel's fasting and praying, then Gabriel shows up to him and says, hey, Daniel, God heard your prayer the day you prayed it. I was detained for 21 days by who? The prince of Persia. I had to call forth for Michael to contend against him to get the message. That wasn't a demon. That was a fallen angel. They're two separate things. So I think Pastor Jeff and Chuck Nuss are absolutely right. Demons are not even mentioned until after the Nephilim are destroyed. And I think demon spirits are the actual disembodied spirits of the Nephilim, which was the watcher angels. The Bible talks about Genesis 6, landed on Mount Hermon. They took wives, each of whom they chose, which if you read it in the Hebrew, which you could probably read that, is by force. Bore children unto them, which the Bible says became the mighty men, the men of renown. They're killed, and then those spirits are roaming the earth till, remember, when the maniac of Gadara ran towards Jesus. We get another insight to that. And he says, the demons speak to him and says, what do we have to do with thee, thou Jesus of Nazareth? They knew exactly who he was. And said, hast thou come to torment us before what? Our time. They know there's a payday coming. But they knew, hey, right now we do have legal authority to operate here. And knows Jesus didn't say they didn't, but he just told them who they were, and they told him who he was, and then they asked him for permission. So there's a lot of little clues there. There's a big
references.
distinction, yeah, between
The
fallen
idea
angels and
there,
demons.
there's
Yeah.
ranks and all this kind of stuff was the last note that I took. Let's see, let's move on. We'll try to get there. We're about 30
Yeah,
minutes
sorry.
out. No.
This is just
Absolutely.
I love this.
Chapter 2. Chapter 2, I'm really just going to summarize a couple of things that Mr. pointed out because we looked at chapter 10 and this very much, we spent at least a 30-minute window here in one of our sessions just very recently about the word sanctified and sanctification. I want to clear up some stuff because I heard more about what Mr. dove into it and I'm like, whoa, and I listened to this many times, this little 15-minute window of what he was talking about here. That comes up as well in chapter 2, the idea of the sanctification. It's technically chapter 2:11. I'm not going to look at it. There's your reference. I want to make sure that this is pretty clear. I'm trying to understand it myself, and Nisler does draw it out pretty well here. And I did check with Pastor Jeff about this at one of our fellowships about these terms and how legitimate this was, just to double check. He said, yeah, he was right on board with this. And it definitely comes up in Scripture, I think, so help me with that, with different references. What he's going to talk about is that when we say the idea of salvation, and this is a great word, obviously, but that's very ambiguous. And the reason that it's very ambiguous is because we tend to think of salvation as only this idea of a future event. That's not the case at all. The idea that salvation is in three parts. First is the justification. And I'll just put the terms up here. Sanctification's next. And then glorification. And what are these? These definitely represent the ideas of past, present, and future. So there's a timeline going on here.
Oh, that's interesting.
Okay? Justification is basically the idea of once you have said and believed, taken into your heart, this idea of, I believe. Okay? I believe in the Messiah. I believe in Christ. I've taken it up. You're justified. We've talked about that a lot, the idea especially of doing works, and which is very confusing too, and I can see a lot now from Hebrews and why people might confuse some of this. The idea of doing works gets me closer. Okay? No. It's just the idea of the justification, the idea of faith and faith alone, basically.
Amen.
Okay? So faith. The idea of sanctification, and I'm trying to tease this out just a little bit more, is the present tense. I've got a couple of different ways of going in here. This I'm going to go back to justification, removes the guilt. Okay? So if you're defining it, removes the guilt and the penalty of sin from your faith. Removes the guilt and the penalty of sin. The idea of sanctification makes the sinner righteous and removes the growth and power of sin. Removes the growth and power of sin. Okay. And then glorification is this idea that this declares us righteous. This is the future event. So, and he goes on for this a good bit, but there's this other quote. He quotes another one of his friends that had famously said this: I am saved. I am being saved. I will be saved.
Yeah.
And the idea there is that that's moving around. Okay, that especially here in the present tense, Pastor Jeff has mentioned quite a few times this idea of the daily walk. Okay, that's what he's talking about. This idea that we have been blessed, basically, the way I kind of see it, and that as we're constantly in this, and the idea is that the Holy Spirit is with us. So justification is for us. Sorry. Sanctification is in us. Okay. And glorification declares us righteous. Good way of looking at it. Let's see, anything else here? Swaggart as well. I had one of the Jimmy Swaggart's book of Hebrews that he goes through. Great commentary. Jimmy Swaggart, Pastor Jeff, let me have too. One of his quotes here was that the idea that justification, Christ has fought for us. He's fighting for us. That was that moment. Okay, belief. Sanctification, the Holy Spirit is fighting in us. Okay.
Oh, wow, that's good.
Yeah.
I never thought about that.
And there's a fancy term, and as you're reading some of these commentaries, the more that you do, and you should be, I mean, footnotes, in fact, are a lot of times, the best reading of trying to get your understanding. The eschatology, that's what we're looking at in eschatological, I'm trying to remember how to spell this. Eschatology, how do you pronounce that?
Eschatology.
Eschatology,
Yeah.
thank you.
Yes, sir.
The idea of
The end time.
salvation in the end, the future event. Okay, we're pushing towards this. Faith is, we have faith, we made that choice, we're living with it, our daily walk, and then eventually we have the gifts of the inheritance. Okay? Something like that. A lot of that in chapter 2. Let's move on to chapter 3. Let's see. As we saw in the very beginning, in chapter 1 or so, basically your author is going to come right out the gate, and he's going to basically argue, and this is where, we keep hearing this over and over, that, at least from what the pastors have said here, that there are many churches out there, they do exist, where they're going to say something like the Old Testament has become irrelevant, what we really need to focus on and what really is just important is just the New Testament.
Which is completely wrong.
Completely wrong, and the reason that that is so wrong, it is so clear that if you've read Hebrews, all that Paul is doing in his rhetoric to persuade them to stay with their Christian faith, all he's doing is looking at Old Testament references. He's using it all the time, Psalms particularly, okay? But he's going all the way back, using references. In fact, that is the major strategy here of the rhetoric. How do I convince these Jews to stay with Christ, that the Old Testament has all these references, and that's why we're looking. Don't you see it? And now here it is. It was right in front of you, okay? So as we're going forward, know that is in there.
Yeah, and that's probably the main reason, or one of the main reasons that God chose Paul to be the bearer of the gospel, because he had such a knowledge of the scriptures that the others,
Exactly.
they knew, but they didn't know like Paul knew, because
Yeah.
he had studied his whole life.
Under
Yeah.
Gamaliel.
Yeah.
Another reason that it's just apparent that Paul probably wrote
Yeah.
this, because it is just absolutely by the hands of a master.
That's a great point. Something I've never thought of, that God in his omniscience said, you know what, I'm going to not just take some rando off the street.
Absolutely.
He actually chose the premier scholar of the law in his day, because the Judaizers would have listened to
Yeah.
him, because he was like, listen, I know what I'm talking about. In fact, he goes on
Yeah.
and says that I'm a Pharisee of Pharisees, and he said, and I know the law better than any of you.
Exactly.
He even said that with authority, and that wasn't in a braggadocious way. It was like, y'all can't hold a candle to the knowledge that I have of the law. And that's a great point I never thought of. That's why God chose him.
He goes on to say, and I think this is a very valid point. In chapter 3, towards the end here, he starts mentioning that we've seen that, well, Jesus is better, he's higher quality, or superior to the angels. Okay, that's a big thing, especially the Jews. Okay.
Right.
Also, he's going to say that this tradition that's upon us now, which we know was probably within the first few months, okay, after the cross, this idea here, he's going to argue that Jesus is more important and has a higher priority than Moses. And what all chapter 3, and he's going to continue to come back to this moment, that Moses, he's not looking down on that or anything, it's just this idea that Moses, and he's going to use this moment of the Exodus, okay, and the great provocation, you've heard of this, where the people basically rebel, okay, and God tries to get them, how many times is he's like, here's what you need to do, here's what you need to do, basically, and they never do it.
No.
In other words, this is a failure, okay, so they never listened, basically, the great provocation, and he's going to mention this throughout Hebrews. There's quite a few moments, especially in 3, and it comes back up later. So understanding that is really important, okay?
Well, it's interesting to note the Judaizers really deified Moses and Elijah,
Yeah.
especially. Like,
Deified.
that's what I mean. They really deified them, which was not correct at all. Paul rebuked them many times on that.
No.
They were men just like anybody else.
Yeah.
And Jesus died for them. In fact, they were in paradise. Remember when Jesus finally gave up the ghost and went and preached unto the captives? Well, Moses and Elijah and Elisha and Enoch, they were there.
Yeah.
You know, so it's like they weren't So that's kind of, I can see Paul's frustration, like,
Yeah. I want to talk about, because in the sessions too, there was a great bit that Pastor talked about with rest. And I have to say, now that I've read Hebrews, I see why this is so confusing. As you go through here, it's just not apparent. I've read commentary after commentary, looking back through everything. What does this mean and what's going on with this idea of rest? So there it is. I'm kind of just going to let that stay there. So we can ponder it even more. I'd like to hear more about this idea of rest. But the idea is not just like you're resting from labor. The idea is that we are going to go towards this great rest. I think I'll just move on with from there. I know we're going to be running short on time. I'd like to get us right up to date here. Chapter 5, let's see. He talks about the idea of priests. And we know that from... we have two different setups here. You have the old covenant, okay, covenant, and the new covenant, and there's all these different things that are happening with priests, okay. And over chapter 5, 6, and 7, we're going to see that kind of laid out for us, okay. Human priests are appointed to act on behalf of men concerning their relationships with God. And we know the idea there, the old covenant and the old priests, and there's a couple things I want to kind of pull this out and look at it, because I have to do it for myself. What we're talking about, I can't remember exactly the reference where he's going to talk about Melchizedek, and we'll bring that up. In fact, let's just bring it up right now. It's so important in this last 15 minutes, we've got to talk about it. So you have two different orders. And the old covenant. Okay, we're talking about Mosaic law, Moses and Aaron. And the idea here is that you have Aaron and his priestly men in the order here. Okay? Basically, there's that moment, like, who is Aaron? And I was like, wait.
Moses' brother.
It's Moses' brother. And there's that moment where Moses, the burning bush episode in Exodus, right? And like all this is happening, and God says, go talk to the Israelites. Go talk to the Pharaoh and all this. And Moses is like, no, I can't even talk straight. I'm not very eloquent. And God says, I made the human mouth. Please go and tell them, Moses. And Moses is like, can't you pick anyone else? And God finally is just like, just get your brother Aaron to do it. And that's basically what happens.
That's what he said.
That's what happens.
That's what happens.
Go read it. I think it's Exodus 14. I had to go back and check that. I was like, what? Are you serious? And, that's exactly what happened. So this idea that when we say Mosaic law, yeah, the Mosaic law, the Aaron law, is the old covenant, okay? Now what's that versus? It's versus the Melchizedek. And let me see if I can spell this right. Melchizedek. Something like that. Did I get it right? In many different texts, it's spelled with a Z or whatever.
Yeah, I have seen it spelled with a Z too. It's
Melchizedek.
Yeah.
Supposedly we should read that very first one where he's talking about Melchizedek, but I think it's in chapter 7. So 5, 6, 7 is really going to pull that together, but in chapter 7 you get here's who Melchizedek is and why he's so important. And just in a nutshell here, we can see, because Christ is often referenced, that he's in the order of the priestly order of Melchizedek, not in the idea of...
Because Melchizedek's priesthood had no beginning nor had an ending, I guess.
And we're going to say, and as it's introduced with Melchizedek, it's going to say, and we should just read it, it is right there, chapter 7, verse 1. Chapter 7, verse 1, if you have it there. For this Melchizedek, king of Salem, priest of the Most High God, who met Abraham returning from the slaughter of the kings and blessed him. You can keep going there, John. Is there another one right past you? To whom also Abraham gave a 10th part of all, first being by interpretation king of righteousness, and after that also king of Salem, which is king of peace. Keep going. You get it right. Without father, without mother, without descent, having neither beginning of days nor end of life, but made like unto the Son of God, abideth a priest continually. And I looked this up, and first was the idea of without a father, without a mother. Is this an immortal? Is this basically a pre-incarnate Christ, which is definitely an interpretation of some level?
Sure.
And is this idea of been made like unto the Son of God? Does that mean he looks like Jesus? I don't really know. It seems to kind of point to some of that, but What is traditional though is that with a lot of these priests, they have to, there's a structure, a high structure of application to become a priest basically. And you have to have your date of birth, how old are you, who was your mother, who was your father, when were you born, etc. And it's basically like your application in some ways. And there's commentary that just point to this basically meaning that it wasn't listed for Melchizedek. Okay, but no matter what, Melchizedek is prior to Aaron, because we see this the reference here of Abraham. Okay, there's a few things here that's worth noting that the Aaronic priestly thing, priestly order of law here, you have to have the credentials. You have to have credentials. Okay, a few other things: family, lineage, and the law. And this law. The Aaronic law, we know because the Aaronic and Mosaic tradition, okay, is the idea of the Old Covenant. And here's what covenant. It's the idea of the priests are human. And there's this whole section there where normal high priests, because Jesus is higher than them, normal high priests are human. So they sin, and even while they're trying to take in the offerings, they're sinning as well, and they don't have enough compassion for basically for the sacrifices of the people that are trying to turn everything in. So we get to see that what we're trying to see up here is with Melchizedek, that all of this over here in the Old Covenant now is perfection, the idea of becoming perfect, or the idea of the light of God, I guess. Perfection is unattainable. You can't quite get there, okay? But with Melchizedek and, of course, Christ, it is. We can. So this is attainable, and this is where the commentaries go. Okay? So, and we know that as Christ as a priest is not going through the normal structures of things. He didn't, turn in an application of how old he was, and tell him all this information to go and then become the priest in the temple, right? Didn't do any of that. Didn't have to. Let's see. So the idea here is that, let's see. Well, Melchizedek has, Christ
I'll
is
make a
like
comment on that. I really have always leaned more towards that's the pre-incarnate Christ, Melchizedek.
I wondered,
priesthood.
okay.
Because, there's nobody else in the scripture ever referenced in any shape or form as being as the likeness unto the Son of God. When it says without father, without mother, which is that to me in context is talking about an earthly mother, an earthly father. And I say that because it says without descent, having neither beginning of days. John, you have a mother, you have a father, so do I. And then it says, nor end of life. Okay, well, there is no other angel that's mentioned in that context. And there's only a few mentioned by name anyway. Michael, Gabriel, Lucifer, and Abaddon in the Hebrew, Apollyon in the Greek. That's it in the scripture. So I think that's what that means. To me, that's the only thing that makes sense.
It makes sense.
Is that priesthood is after the order of Melchizedek, because that was a pre-incarnate Christ. There was no beginning, there's no ending.
Okay.
And then Paul references him again as what? We have not a high priest who's not touched by our infirmities. He's talking about being our high priest multiple times.
Yeah.
So I think that, to me, that's the only thing that ever makes sense. Still conjecture on my part.
With just the last few minutes, chapter 8, 9, and 10, I think, let's go through chapter 8 really quickly. With chapter 8, what we're going to see is this unpacking of the Old Covenant versus the new Covenant. And basically you get all that in chapter 8, 9, and 10 of this idea of talking about all the steps, the rituals of the old priests, all this. What it comes down to is that the Old Covenant versus the New Covenant. Okay, the Old Covenant is basically now obsolete, and even when you read some of the scripture there, you'll see it ends with chapter 8. In that he said that a new covenant he hath made the first old, now that which decayeth and waxeth old is ready to vanish away. And there's particular scriptures like that where as you read through there, you can get very confused that what he's saying, and it seems to me that
the old covenant is the Old Testament. And that's not what it's saying at all. Don't get confused with that, because it's very, I can see it kind of sounds the same or something,
Yeah.
but the meaning behind covenant and the Old Testament is two completely different things. The idea of the Old Covenant is the way they did things in their services,
The sacrifices.
etc. Now that's in the Old Testament, okay? But the Old Testament in general is not being made obsolete. That's not it at all. In fact, the New Covenant and in its laws is going to point back to the Old Testament.
Yes.
In exactly what Hebrews is doing. It's looking back at everything and saying, see, there's where it was. There's where it was again. And now we're in, and I think the better way of looking at this, just to make it very clear, especially a lot of beginners or people that are really trying to study it, is that the Old Covenant is just really, or the Old Testament is just part one. It's part one. And that the New Covenant, the New Testament is part two. And that's the way you should look at it for the most part, because you need part one to understand what's
Yeah.
going on in part two, okay? But when you're talking about covenant, it's just the tediousness of the actual sacrifices, rituals of the priests, and now we don't need that, or at least a lot of it, okay? And we're figuring that out.
Well, and like you said about the sacrifice, people got to understand the animals were sacrificed as what? Pointing to the Messiah who would come and be what? The final sacrifice and propitiation for
Yeah.
all of mankind's sin.
Yeah.
That's why they called him what Paul said. They were types and shadows. So, like I said, it's part one. It's introducing. This is the whole plan. You know, this is how the movie is unfolding, and then we go. Okay, so the animal sacrifices were pointing to the Messiah. He dies on the cross, and then he fulfilled that.
And you might be sitting here thinking, well, like, isn't this so obvious to the Jews that are sitting there? Why would Paul really need to be able to really stress and really come back to this over and over again? There's even this one moment, and it's in there, I think, somewhere. Maybe it's the end of chapter 9, or I've lost my place now with so many notes. There's this one point where Paul is just saying, you are like children, and you're drinking milk when you should be eating meat.
Yeah.
And remember that part? And
Yes.
basically I don't think he's talking down to them, but he's basically just saying, you have forgotten the fundamentals of what we're doing here. And you have to kind of keep that in place with the context too. They're being persecuted and tortured and all this kind of stuff. So it's very difficult. I'm sure it seems like, you know, some of the Jews are sitting there just like, let's go back to part one and let's just stay over there.
We'll just get along and
Yeah,
and live
go
in
back
peace.
to, let's go
Right.
sacrifice some goats, right? Like, and go back to the old ways, when really you can't. That's not what's going on. So I think that really
That's a great
opening
point, though, when you bring that up. A lot of people don't understand the persecution, and you're thinking, I mean, I could just go sacrifice a lamb once a year, and I don't have to be, fed to the lions or whatever. And maybe some people were doing that, but by doing that outwardly, in their heart, they're denying the Lord.
Yeah.
Just like if it comes down to that country, they're going to throw you in prison. Well, all right, I've had a bunch of friends that went. You'll be fine. Lord will protect you when you get there. So it's like, is it worth throwing your eternity away or sit for a few years in prison? I'd take prison personally.
Right, there you go. In chapter 9, just really quickly, I want to point out, in case you want to read this, I thought it was fascinating. You get this idea of the old covenant and what they're doing, but you also get very detailed descriptions of the tabernacle and you start getting the processes of what's going on, which I find is, I knew nothing of this till I started looking at this. And in chapter 9 too, they actually mention, okay, you walk into the first corridor and you see this. You walk into the second door, or second curtain behind the second corridor, you'll see this is the most holy place. Okay, and then there's where, the Ark of the Covenant is. They mention the Ark of the Covenant. Overlaid round with gold, wherein was the golden pot that had the manna, and Aaron's rod that budded, and the tables of the covenant, and all this, with the cherubims of glory shadowing the mercy seat, of which we cannot now speak particularly. They go through all these old, basically from the old covenant stuff, and then it switches. He goes into saying, see how Christ has changed everything, basically. Okay, so chapter 9, since we are in chapter 10 is where we are with the session that we'll pick up with Pastor Jeff next week. Go back and read chapter 9 if you can have time, because it's just so good with the idea of how they're really
giving you all the details of everything. And then in chapter 10, and we'll end there, I'd like to look back at that particular set of verses where now, when I was sitting in a session just 2 or 3 sessions ago, I believe I even asked Diana, I was like, what does this mean? And it's that section in chapter 10, let me see if I can find it right, I'm totally looking at it. We get the sanctification, there it is, where you talk, okay, yeah. And then said he, Lo, I come to do thy will, O God. He taketh away the first, talking about the first covenant, that he may establish the second. And we talked about that for a good 20, 30 minutes on all that. I was trying to understand it. But now to see, going back and looking at it, that's what he's talking about. Taking away this idea of the old covenant to get to the new covenant.
What verse was that?
That's verse chapter 10, sorry, chapter 10, verse 9. And go on through there, by the which we we are sanctified through the offering of the body of Jesus Christ once and for all. There you go. So this idea that you don't have to keep sacrificing this week and then another sacrifice. Well, Jesus has already done this.
And how he drives that point home by offering of the body of Jesus Christ once and for all. In other words,
That's it.
Paul, of which I believe you wrote, he's saying, it's done. There is
Done.
nothing else y'all need to do other than keep your faith anchored in what he did for
That's
you.
it.
That's it.
Yeah. Even
driving
uses
that
that
point
word.
home.
Mhm. So that's it, and I'm right off to the minute here, folks. I've been keeping.
That was great. I love it. Yeah.
Thank you very much.
I'm gonna tell you, I think that was one of the best ways I've ever heard anybody teach Hebrews is break it down with the timelines and then the context. That was phenomenal.
Thank you.
I would have never even
Thanks for your
thought to
comments.
even dive into that. That's from now when I meet people that are new believers and they ask me, that's how I would approach it from now on. That makes it so much clearer. Because people have only been saved maybe a year, 2, 3 years. They don't have any idea. They're like, I don't understand what's going on here. Why are these?
Guys, we can definitely keep going a little bit. If you have other questions or comments, being a student, I don't know how much I will be able to really answer them, but what in it has confused you, I imagine, or if there's anything you want, I know I flew through it, but anything you want to talk about, I'm definitely willing to hang out for a few more minutes or addressing
I
it.
enjoyed the context of the rhetoric.
Yeah.
That explains so much.
Yeah,
They
Yeah,
Yeah, it
want
does.
dialogue with each other.
absolutely, yeah.
It's just, why don't you just dead it out, say what you want to say, but they go on and on.
Right,
And,
yeah.
and wax this and that. And now we-
Experts at it by this point. They are very good at it.
I enjoyed that.
So the idea there is that, well, someone like Paul had been versed in that in school all the way through. I'm sure it's something he knew a lot about.
Right.
Like, how do you go about writing an extremely, it's an argumentative essay, basically, in defense of what he's trying to get them to see, so.
I was
And-
gonna,
Go ahead, Barbara.
That's the greatest guy.
I was just gonna point out that Pastor had said something that just really spoke to me a long time ago, several years ago, and he was talking about the priest's standard daily ministering. But what he said, he made a point of, is that Christ sat down
Yes.
because his work was finished.
Yep.
Yes, and didn't
And that's
mention
in
that,
verse
yeah.
12, that he sat
Yeah.
down on the, he's not up there pacing, he's not up
Right.
there worrying, there's no more work to do. He sat down because his job was done, we just have to surrender to
Exactly.
that, right?
Because
And
the high
that
priest
just
had to-
spoke so much to me at the
Yeah.
beginning.
Right, remember when he died on the cross? And then he says, it is finished. That was it. It was
Yeah.
done.
Yeah.
So God looked and said, the sacrifice is
Yeah.
adequate. It's more than adequate. That's it. And then he went down,
Great
preached on the captives. And then the Bible says that he sat down at the right hand of God. In
That's
fact,
a
interesting side
huge
note,
symbolic.
when Stephen, who's the first martyr, the only time mentioned, Jesus is mentioned standing was when Stephen died.
Yes.
And Stephen's being stoned and says,
Wow.
behold, I see the Son of God standing at the right.
Oh.
I think, and my dad's the only person I've ever heard say this, I think Jesus himself was standing up welcoming Stephen into heaven, which is probably,
First
might be
martyr.
what he does with everybody that dies.
Yeah.
Because that's the only time he's ever mentioned.
Wow.
Because if John was the king of Great Britain right now, let's say, and we were and he's
Would be
not,
true.
he's coronated as a king. Well, what does he do? He goes and he sits on the throne. He doesn't stand there 12 hours a day.
Right.
No, he sits down, symbolizing that he's the king now, that his work is done. And I think that was interesting, that Jesus, that was it, it was done, that was the.
So just to conclude there, I think, where do we leave off for next session, guys? I think it was chapter 10.
Yeah, it was chapter 10, verse 9,
somewhere
I
around
think. Wasn't that
Verse
right?
14.
Oh, was it verse 14?
16.
Thank you,
Chapter
Teresa.
10, verse 16, and just I'd like to thank the pastors for all they do here and everyone here as well. Give me the opportunity to do this. It's definitely been cool. I've learned so much just from the sessions, an amazing amount, much less try to actually get it across to you. So thank you very much, and we'll see you soon.